The altimeter spun down like a broken watch as Flight Lieutenant David Perry pushed the control column forward at 31,000 feet. His photo-reconnaissance Mosquito had been gliding above the Ruhr Valley, cameras quietly snapping pictures of German industrial sites, when the radio suddenly hissed with a message every recon pilot feared. Bandits! 8 o'clock high. Two Focke-Wulf 190s had burst out of a cloud bank, their engines roaring as they closed in fast. Perry's navigator, Sergeant Jeffrey Morris, didn't need to say a word. They both knew what that meant. Those Fw-190s could fly at nearly 400 miles per hour, and the Mosquito, stripped of guns and armor to make room for cameras, had only a slim 10mm of edge. The math of survival was cruelly simple. The German fighters had 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns. The Mosquito carried nothing but film, courage, and speed. One short burst from those cannons could turn their wooden plane into dust over Germany. Perry had already slammed the throttles past the limit, forcing every last bit of power from the twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. The airspeed needle climbed, 370, 380 mph, still not enough. It was March 1943, and RAF photo-recon Mosquitos were flying deeper into Germany than ever before. The pictures they brought back, of factories, rail lines, and submarine bases, were priceless. But the cameras were useless if they didn't return home. Dead pilots developed no film. Behind them, tracers began slicing through the sky. The Germans had the height and the speed. Physics was on their side. In a tail chase, the Fw-190's superior diving speed would close the gap in minutes. Perry could see it happening. The black crosses on enemy wings growing larger in his mirror. Evasive turns only cost more speed. The Mosquito was already at full power, engines howling far past safe limits. The German fighters, cool and skilled, kept gaining from 7,000 feet above. Every Mosquito crew knew the rumors. Some whispered of a desperate trick, one that went against everything in the training manuals. Instead of climbing or running level, you pointed the nose straight down and dove. Hard. You went faster than the plane was ever meant to go. Past every safety limit. Into speeds where wings could snap, controls could freeze, and the wooden body could tear itself apart. But some swore it worked. They said the Mosquito could outdive anything the Luftwaffe had. It could hit speeds that left even the hunters helpless. The maneuver demanded complete faith in a plane made mostly of plywood and balsa, materials that seemed far too fragile for such violence. Perry's hands tightened. The tracers were closer now. His choice existed because of decisions made years earlier in a workshop at Hatfield. When Geoffrey de Havilland's team designed the Mosquito, they did something the Air Ministry thought was madness. They built a modern combat plane out of wood, not as a desperate backup, but as an intentional experiment that gave the Mosquito unique strengths no metal plane could match. Its fuselage was a molded birch shell glued with caisson, shaped in huge concrete molds. Its wings combined spruce beams and plywood skin, light yet incredibly strong. Where hurricanes or Spitfires bent and tore under stress, the Mosquito flexed and absorbed it. It bent where metal would break. That flexibility wasn't a weakness. It was a hidden gift. Metal planes had rigid frames with predictable limits. Push too far, and the wings could fold like paper. The Mosquito's wooden design didn't have those same boundaries. It could survive conditions that would destroy other aircraft. The smooth plywood surface also made it more aerodynamic than riveted metal skins, which created tiny drag spots at high speed. The Mosquito's finish was polished and almost glass-like, reducing friction dramatically at 450 mph. Weight balance helped too. With its twin Merlins mounted in the wings, the center of gravity stayed forward, while the wooden rear fuselage remained feather-light, just enough to support the tail. That gave the Mosquito perfect balance in a dive. Metal bombers grew nose-heavy and fought the stick. The Mosquito stayed steady, eager even to point downward. De Havilland's engineers hadn't built it for death dives. But now, high over Germany, Perry was about to find out if that unplanned gift could save their lives. To be a fast bomber that could simply outrun enemy fighters by flying at great heights. The reconnaissance versions, made even lighter and polished until they shone like mirrors, were only meant to fly higher and faster than anything the enemy could send after them. No one at Hatfield had ever imagined pilots intentionally diving toward the ground at near-terminal velocity, breaking every speed record ever tested. But the wooden construction gave the Mosquito a strange advantage. It didn't have strict limits the way metal aircraft did. Metal planes had carefully calculated never-exceed speeds, drawn by stress engineers in red ink. The Mosquito's boundaries were softer, points where the controls felt heavy, the airframe groaned, and the wings hummed with strain. But total failure was still a theory, not an immediate fact. Test pilots had pushed the Mosquito to 420 mm in level flight and roughly 460 in shallow dives. What might happen at 500 or even 550 mm? Nobody knew. The wooden body also made repairs far easier. Damage that would ground a metal fighter for weeks could be fixed by skilled carpenters in days. Whole sections of the wing could be replaced using basic tools. This meant more Mosquitoes stayed flying, more crews gained experience, and more of them learned what the plane could truly do when survival meant pushing beyond every written rule. Perry didn't know much about the science, only that his plane was made of wood, and that wood had saved Mosquito crews before. The Focke-Wulf 190 had entered Luftwaffe service in 1941, and within weeks it shattered the RAF's comfort and confidence. The Spitfire Mach V, once supreme over Britain, was suddenly outclassed. The Fw-190 could climb faster, dive steeper, roll quicker, and its weapons hit harder. German pilots nicknamed it the Butcher Bird, a hunter that impaled its victims. For Mosquito crews, the Fw-190 was more than a threat. It was a constant nightmare designed exactly to hunt them down. Its BMW radial engine pushed out 1,700 horsepower, giving it a top speed of 400 mph at 20,000 feet. Worse, it could maintain that speed even where the air thinned and other engines struggled. Photo-reconnaissance. Mosquitoes usually operated between 25,000 and 35,000 feet, and the Fw-190 could reach those altitudes with ease. The men flying them were no rookies either. By 1943, the Luftwaffe had assigned veteran pilots to the Jagdschwader units guarding key industrial sites. These men had hundreds of combat hours. They knew the Mosquito's habits, its steady photographic runs, its timing near dawn or dusk when long shadows revealed detail on the ground. The problem was simple geometry. During a photo run, a Mosquito had to stay level for 30 to 60 seconds while the cameras exposed their frames. For those seconds, it was predictable, visible, and defenseless. German radar spotted high-altitude intruders and scrambled interceptors to climb above them, unseen against the sun, then dive with gravity's help. Once that dive began, physics favored the attacker. The Fw-190's metal frame and heavy wings let it build speed faster than the lighter Mosquito. German pilots usually opened fire from about 800 yards, closing to 400. Close enough that even a glancing burst could tear a wing or cut a control line. The 20mm cannons fired explosive shells that didn't need direct hits to kill. A near miss could rip the wooden skin apart. Mosquito losses to Fw-190s had been rising since late 1942. Number 544 Squadron from Benson in Oxfordshire had lost 3 in January alone. Number 140 Squadron from Leuchars, Scotland, lost 2 more in February. Those losses were unbearable. Each Mosquito cost thousands of hours to build, and each crew required months of training. Every failed mission meant lost intelligence. Photos not taken, targets not bombed, factories still producing weapons. Usual evasion tactics, Sharp weaves, fast climbs, spiral dives worked against the lighter Messerschmitt 109s, but not the Fw-190. Against the Focke-Wulf, the same moves only delayed death. The German fighter could match every turn and still line up for the kill. Perry had seen gun camera films, Mosquitos breaking apart mid-air, wings folding up, fuselages tumbling like autumn leaves. The same wooden design that made the Mosquito fast also made it burn beautifully once incendiary rounds touched its fuel or hydraulics. The Fw-190 wasn't just an enemy. It was an assassin built to destroy everything Perry's mission stood for. But Perry had one thing few photo pilots did: experience. He had spent 6 months at the Aircraft and Armament Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down in 1941, testing modified Hurricanes and early Mosquito prototypes. He was the man who had once flown aircraft past every safe limit to see what happened next. Test aircraft past their supposed limits, finding where theory ended and reality began. Test pilots lived in that thin line between what engineers calculated and what machines could truly endure. That experience had taught Perry one essential truth: the official never-exceed speeds were cautious. Safe numbers padded for average pilots flying in average weather. The Mosquito's manual listed a maximum dive speed of 415 midi. Perry himself had once pushed it 30 km/h faster during testing. The aircraft had shuddered and groaned, but it hadn't fallen apart. The wings had flexed dangerously. The controls had grown heavy in his hands, but the Mosquito held together. Most important of all, its acceleration had been staggering, jumping from 380 to 445 mph in under 20 seconds of near-vertical descent. Now, with the Fw-190s just 5,000 feet above and closing fast, Perry could see their blunt noses and black crosses clearly. Morris's voice crackled in his headset, tight with fear but steady. "They're ranging us! 15 seconds to firing!" The choice was clear. Staying level meant death in half a minute. Evasive turns might delay it by seconds, but not change the end. The Germans had the speed, the height, and the position. They would catch the Mosquito, fire and shatter it, and 2 lives with one short burst. But Perry's test pilot instincts overpowered his fear. The voice in his head whispering, "Don't dive," was silenced by calculation. He thought in angles, velocity, and structural load. The Mosquito's wooden wings wouldn't snap instantly. They would bend first, warn him. Its smooth plywood skin would slice through air more cleanly than the riveted German fighters. Its light tail meant it wouldn't nose over uncontrollably. "Hang on," Perry said calmly, and shoved the control column forward with both hands. The Mosquito's nose dropped through the horizon, falling like a stone from a cliff. The altimeter spun wildly. 30,000 feet, 28,000, numbers blurring too fast to read. The twin Merlin engines screamed as the propellers over-revved into the red. Perry throttled back to idle. Gravity was their new engine. The airspeed needle surged 400 millifreedoms, 420, 40, and still rising. Behind them, the German fighters followed, rolling inverted into their own dives, confident in their superior speed. In theory, the heavier Focke-Wulfs should have caught them in seconds. But they didn't. The Mosquito was diving faster than Perry had ever known possible. The plane shook. Not the deadly flutter of failure, but a deep, rhythmic vibration, like the heartbeat of the airframe itself. The wings were flexing perfectly, absorbing the pressure. 442. A-Thetones, C4-150. The controls grew heavy, resisting his grip. Morris said nothing, staring at the spinning altimeter as they plunged through unknown air. They were falling almost 6,000 feet per minute, on the edge of suicidal speed. But something was happening behind them. The Fw-190s were dropping back. Perry risked a quick glance at the mirror. The German fighters were still there, still diving hard. But the distance was opening fast. 20,000 feet now, airspeed at 470 mph, and the gap widening every second. The physics were impossible, or so everyone had thought. In level flight, the Fw-190's weight gave it the advantage. But in a near-vertical dive, everything changed. Terminal velocity, the top speed a body could reach through air, wasn't just about mass. It depended on how much drag fought against gravity. The Mosquito's ultra-smooth wooden skin gave it less drag than the Germans had ever expected. Drag increased with the square of speed. At 300 mph, a rivet made no difference. At 500 mph, that same rivet created 4 times the resistance, multiplied by thousands across the Fw-190's metal skin. The German fighters were covered with them, each one a microscopic break. The Mosquito's doped, polished surface, cared for by ground crews who knew smoothness meant survival, was aerodynamically perfect. The Fw-190's broad radial engine, powerful but bulky, created enormous drag up front. Its wide cowlings were like a wall against the rushing air. The Mosquito's narrow inline merlins, buried in sleek nacelles, sliced through the sky instead. Every choice de Havilland's engineers had made for smooth cruising, streamlining, balance, surface polish, was now saving lives in a regime they had never imagined. Wing loading mattered too, but not as everyone assumed. The Fw-190's heavier wings gave it an early advantage in the dive, yes, but as speeds passed 450 mph, the air itself began to change. It grew denser. Compressibility effects started to appear. The Focke-Wulf's thick wings, designed for lift and strength, were about to meet their limits, to warn pilots where the limits lay. But in that dive over Germany, Perry had learned those limits were far wider than anyone had imagined. The Focke-Wulf's thick wings, which housed its cannons, were now biting into compressibility. Shock waves rippled along their routes, dragging the aircraft as if invisible hands were pulling it backward. The Mosquito's thinner, more elegant wing profile delayed those effects, slicing the dense air cleanly. Perry could feel the aircraft fighting him, trembling as the air thickened like syrup. 18,000 feet, 485 miles per hour. The wings bowed upward in a graceful, terrifying arc, an angle that would have snapped any metal spar. Yet, the laminated wood absorbed the force, spreading the strain evenly, vibrating rather than breaking. The controls were changing too. At such speeds, the slightest movement of the stick produced enormous force. Perry's arms ached as he held steady, muscles burning, every nerve focused on not overcorrecting. He cranked the elevator trim fully forward, but even that felt like turning a wheel locked in stone. Behind him, the German pilots were facing chaos. Their fighters were shaking violently. Control columns stiff as iron, airframes buckling under stress. The Mosquito ahead of them wasn't just escaping, it was disappearing. The Fw-190s were being left behind by something they had never seen. A wooden ghost pulling away at impossible speed. At 15,000 feet, Perry began his recovery. Slowly, painfully slowly, he eased back on the control column. The Mosquito resisted, then responded. The G-forces built sharply. 2 Gs, 3, 4. The wings now flexed downward under the load. Morris's vision dimmed at the edges, the crushing pressure forcing him into his seat. The altimeter spun back upward as descent turned to forward flight. 10,000 feet, and finally, level. The engines idled, windmilling in the slipstream. Airspeed fell. 400, 380, 350. When Perry glanced behind, the sky was empty. The Fw-190s had broken off around 12,000 feet, unwilling or unable to continue. They had been outrun, utterly and unbelievably, by an aircraft made of wood and glue. For the first time in minutes, the radio was silent. No more warnings, no more danger. Only the soft hum of the Merlin engines as Perry gently eased the throttles forward and began climbing back toward safe cruising altitude. The cockpit was quiet except for their breathing. Then Morris spoke, his voice trembling with disbelief. "We shouldn't be alive." Perry exhaled, the adrenaline leaving his system at last. "No," he said quietly, "but we are." His hands shook now, the delayed cost of concentration and fear. They had dived from 31,000 feet to 9,000 in under 4 minutes, reaching speeds beyond anything ever recorded. He'd need to tell the ground crew the airspeed indicator might not be trustworthy anymore. But they had survived, and the cameras in the nose carried priceless photographs of the Ruhr. 3 hours later, they landed at RAF Benson. Perry filed his mission report as usual, but this time he added an appendix. He detailed every second of the escape, the speeds, the G-forces, how the aircraft behaved, and exactly where the Mosquito's acceleration had surpassed the pursuing fighters. Most crucially, he wrote the conclusion in plain words: successful evasion from a tactically superior enemy through extreme diving. The report reached Wing Commander Robert Oakley of 544 Squadron on February 19, 1943. Oakley had already lost 3 crews in 6 weeks. Desperate for answers, he read Perry's account twice. It defied logic and training, but the facts were unarguable. A crew that should have died had returned alive, with mission-critical film. Oakley called Perry to his office. "Can you do it again?" he asked. "Not by accident." "On purpose," Perry thought for a moment. "Yes, sir. The aircraft can take more than the manual claims. The wood bends. It doesn't break. The smooth finish keeps drag low. But it demands everything. You have to ignore every instinct that says not to dive." Within a week, Oakley organized a demonstration. On February 26th, using a training Mosquito over Oxfordshire, Perry took 3 squadron pilots aloft as observers. At 25,000 feet, he pushed the nose down and repeated the maneuver, accelerating past 460 mph, pulling out at 8,000. The observers watched the wings flex and felt the crushing G-forces, realizing the unthinkable. The Mosquito could survive and excel where logic said it shouldn't. The maneuver earned a name almost instantly: the power dive, though it required throttling back, not pushing forward. Some airmen called it the crazy dive, acknowledging its insanity. Flight Lieutenant Robert Wilson, who used it on his first mission on March 4th, put it bluntly: "You dive like you're trying to hit Germany. You go until you're sure the wings will come off. Then you go faster." His words captured the mental wall every pilot had to break. From their very first lesson in a Tiger Moth, every flyer had been taught one sacred rule: respect the aircraft's limits. The Air Ministry's notes existed precisely to keep them alive, until now, when survival depended on breaking them for a reason. Never exceed speeds weren't suggestions. They were the razor-thin line between flight and destruction. Yet now, squadron leaders were asking their pilots to ignore those sacred limits, to trust that the manuals were wrong, and that their only chance of living might lie beyond every safety rule ever written. Air Vice Marshal Donald Stevenson, who commanded RAF Benson and oversaw all photo-reconnaissance units, initially refused to sanction any formal training. His memo to Oakley on March 8, 1943, was blunt: "We cannot instruct pilots to exceed aircraft limitations as standard practice. The technique you describe may have worked once under specific conditions, but we cannot build doctrine around structural gambling." Stevenson's point was valid. The Air Ministry had invested years of testing, endless calculations, and millions of pounds defining the exact boundaries of safe flight. These limits weren't arbitrary. They were the product of precise engineering. Authorizing pilots to fly past them seemed like madness. One airframe failure during training would kill both crew and the entire idea. but the losses kept coming. Number 544 Squadron lost another Mosquito on March 12th, shot down by Fw-190s over Wilhelmshaven. No. 540 Squadron lost one more over Bremen on March 16th. Each loss meant more than just 2 airmen gone. It meant no photographs, no intelligence, and bombing raids flying blind. The strategic bombing offensive depended entirely on Mosquito eyes bringing back images. Without them, factories stayed untouched, submarines unspotted, the war prolonged. Oakley responded with hard numbers. He sent Stevenson operational data. 5 crews had now escaped using the high-speed dive technique. Flight Lieutenant Michael Carrick had shaken off Fw-190s over Hamburg on March 10th, reaching an estimated 490 mm. Flying Officer James Patterson repeated it over Hanover on March 14th, his navigator noting violent vibrations but no damage. Most importantly, none of the Mosquitoes that attempted the maneuver had broken apart, while 7 using standard evasive tactics had been destroyed since January. The evidence spoke louder than theory. By March 22nd, Stevenson relented. He approved restricted training in what was formally labeled high-speed emergency descent procedures. The authorization came with strict conditions. Training flights had to remain above 10,000 feet for recovery altitude. Dives began at 420 millimeters, increasing in small increments. Any unusual vibration or sign of stress would ground the aircraft for full inspection. Perry, though not an instructor by rank, became the unofficial teacher. His training plan was methodical and cautious. First flights were straight dives to 430 meters, with recovery at 15,000 feet, just to let pilots feel the stiffness of the controls and the flexing of the wings. Second flights went to 450 mph to explore vibration limits and identify the onset of dangerous flutter. Only once Perry was satisfied the pilot truly understood the Mosquito's behavior would they attempt dives beyond 470 mph. The real challenge wasn't technical, it was psychological. Squadron leader Adrian Warburton, one of the RAF's most celebrated reconnaissance pilots, attempted his first dive on April 2nd. He pulled out at 405 35 Mach. His debrief was brutally honest. I believed intellectually the aircraft could take the speed. I did not believe it emotionally until I'd done it. That difference between knowing and trusting defined every trainee's struggle. Warburton completed his qualification on April 8th, eventually hitting 485 meters. Within weeks, he used the technique operationally, diving away from 3 F-190s over Kiel and returning unharmed. By late April 1943, the change was measurable. Number 544 Squadron's losses dropped from 12% in February to 4% in April. Number 540 Squadron reported 0 losses despite flying 23 deep missions into Germany. The power dive hadn't made them invincible, but it had turned near-suicidal missions into survivable ones. And something even more important happened. The technique changed what was possible. Targets once considered untouchable, Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden, were now within reach. Crews volunteered eagerly, knowing they had a weapon no enemy could match: gravity itself. The Luftwaffe soon noticed. Reports from German fighter units described Mosquitoes accelerating away in dives beyond possible speed. At first, intelligence officers dismissed it as exaggeration or confusion. Surely a wooden aircraft couldn't outrun a Focke-Wulf. But as identical reports kept arriving, the truth became clear. The British had discovered something new, something that stripped the Fw-190 of its greatest advantage. In response, Luftwaffe tacticians rewrote their interception orders. Fighters were now told to attack mosquitoes from level flight, or even slightly below, never again from above. The hunter had been forced to adapt to the hunted, diving from above. That adjustment cost the Germans some of their altitude advantage, but denied the British their miraculous escape window. It was proof of the power dive's effectiveness. No enemy rewrites its doctrine to counter a myth. RAF planners quickly adapted. Mission briefings now included clear guidance. If intercepted above 20,000 feet and the sky below is clear, dive at once. Don't wait for the enemy to close. Don't weave. Don't climb. Dive. The Mosquitos. Edge existed only in one narrow slice of flight, speeds above 450 meters per hour in steep descent. That advantage demanded both altitude to build speed and space below to recover safely. Pilots learned to think in 3 dimensions, always preserving height as their escape margin. Navigation became more complex. A full power dive from 30,000 hours to 10,000 feet at 480 miles could carry an aircraft nearly 20 miles ahead of its last known position. Navigators now had to calculate where the recovery would place them, avoiding both dense anti-aircraft zones and friendly lines where a sudden unknown aircraft might trigger defensive fire. Even ground crews began noticing differences. Returning, Mosquitos showed subtle new patterns of wear, propeller tips that needed earlier inspection after enduring extreme airflow, wing roots demanding closer checks for hairline strain, and engines showing reduced bearing life after abrupt transitions, from combat power to idle and back. Yet, these were minor repairs compared to patching bullet holes or salvaging wrecks. The trade was worth it. By June 1943, the power dive was no longer an emergency trick. It was standard procedure for photo-reconnaissance squadrons. Its engineering. Validation, however, wouldn't come until after victory. When secrecy finally lifted in mid-1945, de Havilland's test team returned to the question that war had answered in blood. Chief Test Pilot Jeffrey de Havilland Jr. performed a series of controlled dives at Hatfield in July 1945. The data stunned the very engineers who had built the plane. The Mosquito could safely exceed 500 meters in a dive, nearly 100 meters beyond its official limit, with no structural failure. Post-war analysis confirmed why. Senior aerodynamicist Ronald Bishop reviewed the flight logs alongside combat-tested airframes. His classified 1952 report revealed that Mosquito pilots had, through trial and survival, uncovered an entirely new performance envelope. The wooden monocoque structure distributed stress far more evenly than metal designs. Instead of concentrating strain at joints and rivets, the laminated shell spread the load through its entire body, flexing and absorbing shocks that would have shattered rigid aluminum frames. Even more remarkable, Bishop's team found that the most battle-worn Mosquitos, those that had performed dozens of power dives, showed no cumulative fatigue. The wooden spars hadn't cracked or warped. Each dive stretched them to their elastic limit. But when the stress eased, the wood returned to shape. Metal fatigued. Wood simply breathed and healed. Wind tunnel tests at Farnborough revealed another secret. A perfectly maintained Mosquito had a high-speed drag coefficient nearly 15% lower than the Fw-190. That small aerodynamic edge explained everything. The dive acceleration, the widening gap, the impossible escapes. In a race to 500 meters, the Mosquito would always win because it fought less air resistance with every heartbeat of speed. The engineers also learned something humbling. De Havilland's original never-exceed figure of 415 meters had included a 40% safety margin, a cautious buffer for the unknowns of wood under stress. They had assumed the material would behave like weaker metal. They were wrong. The wood's living flexibility had made the aircraft stronger than its designers dared hope. The lessons shaped aviation far beyond the war. Though the world moved toward all-metal jets, the Mosquito's story changed how engineers thought about airframes. The idea that a structure could flex and live with the air, instead of resisting it completely, became foundational for swept-wing jet design in the 1950s, controlled. Elasticity replaced blind rigidity as the new measure of strength. For the men who pioneered the dive, Vindication came quietly but deeply. They had trusted their hands over the manuals, instinct over instruction, and lived to prove the books wrong. Flight Lieutenant David Parry, the man who had first shoved his Mosquito's nose toward the Ruhr sky and refused to die, read Bishop's engineering report in 1953 and smiled. He had known it all along. He had felt it in the trembling stick, the living wings that bent but never broke, and the clean surge of speed that no metal machine could match. The power dive entered legend, the maneuver that turned predators into witnesses, that made wood superior to steel, and proved that sometimes courage and instinct could reach further than mathematics.